This is why I do this podcast. It's why I wanted to do the specific segments. It's why I do what I do, is that I want to provide an alternative. There is an alternative. People are ready for an alternative. And I think when that opening comes, we have to be ready.
Welcome to The Political Independent, your weekly home for a refreshingly nonpartisan take on the news, as well as thought-provoking discussions on how to improve the American political process. Now here is your host, Gregory Anderson.
Welcome, my friends, to episode number 5 of the podcast. Hope you all had a extremely great week this past week. Mine was pretty decent. I have a great show for you today. Only a couple topics, and I'll explain why just here in a second. The first one I want to go over was a very fascinating article on the Perspectives blog from All Sides. It talked about the shooting that happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Kyle Rittenhouse, he's the 17-year-old who killed 2 protesters. Some claiming there was a lot of media bias by omission, and I seen the after effects of this bias on my Facebook page, and it's rather frustrating to be honest, and it's what's really motivating me to talk about it. So we're going to go over that article in detail. The next topic I want to discuss is another thread from r/centrist. It's titled, "As a centrist, I am scared of the extremism on both sides, and I worry it will affect the election." Now, I hate to validate this person's fears, but I think that is definitely the case, and I am extremely worried, and we're going to talk about that after the first topic. To end the podcast, I haven't gone over the original shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Jacob Blake, again, he was shot in the back 7 times for a reason, and I'm going to explain why I haven't. It has a lot to do with, as we talk about building the independent movement, there are certain things that I think we should want to be associated with the independent movement. And I think having patience in some of these situations is one of them. So we're going to talk about that at the end of the podcast. But before we go there, I would like to thank all of you who have been listening to the podcast. The feedback has been rather tremendous. A lot of people are reaching out to me via personal messages, letting me know how much they enjoyed the podcast. The people who have reviewed the podcast, the 5 stars, have been encouraging. And as you may or may not have noticed, most of the segments that we do on this podcast have been geared towards building the independent movement, something that I talked about in the trailer for the podcast. So I guess this isn't too surprising. So I believe I'm just going to trend more in that direction. So we will update the trailer in about 2 weeks to sort of reflect that. But again, I truly appreciate the kind words and all of the great feedback, and it has me hopeful that we finally have something building here. So there's been a lot of misinformation about this shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin. As I hinted at a second ago, the shooting I'm, of course, referring to is the shooting in which 2 protesters were killed by Kyle Rittenhouse. And there's been so many videos flying out over the course of this past week when all of this happened. And it's really hard to make heads or tails of who's truly at fault here. But the problem is when people have a narrative to push and are extremely eager to blame their political opponents, they care less and less about the actual facts of the story. And it's a troubling trend that's been going on over the last decade. And it's something that we have to talk about. So the title of the piece was "Media Bias Alert, Details Omitted in Reports of Kenosha Shooting." This was from August 27th, 2020. And as I said, there's a few paragraphs here, and we're going to go through the entire thing. I think it's important to point out some of the facts of this case, just in case you missed some yourself. So, 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse has been charged with fatally shooting 2 people during nighttime civil unrest on Tuesday following the officer-involved shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Videos of the incident circulated online almost immediately after it occurred, and media bias by omission was on display in some reports. Bias could be seen on both sides, with both the left and the right painting a slightly different picture of the incident and the shooter. They each included, emphasized, or omitted certain details based on their apparent political bias. Now, the first news outlet that they're referencing here is the Washington Post, which has a lean left bias, which they explain shots were fired around 11:45 on Tuesday, police said. After the first shooting, a young white man carrying a rifle began running north on Sheridan Road, away from a crowd of protesters. Video shows the armed man, Rittenhouse, fall to the ground and then fire multiple rounds into the crowd. 2 or more people fell to the ground, one shot in the arm and the other in the chest, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel reported. Another graphic video shows a man with blood running down his back and his neck, and bystanders shouting that he had been shot in the head. A Washington Post journalist who observed the scene saw the man with a rifle run by with a few protesters in pursuit after gunfire erupted about a block away. He tripped and fell and rolled into a sitting position, raised his gun, and opened fire on his pursuers. Now, that description does not appear to tell the full story. Videos of the incident are graphic, but are easily found on social networking sites. Some YouTube users posted videos dissecting the incident from every angle. All Signs reviewed the videos and found that many media outlets, including the Washington Post, omitted that Kyle's pursuers appeared to have been throwing objects at him, attempting to kick him in his face and hit him with heavy objects, and may have even been armed themselves. Footage appears to show Rittenhouse in a parking lot running from a man who is chasing him and throwing objects at him. Rittenhouse opens fires on the man, who falls on the ground bleeding from his head. Rittenhouse then attempts to call someone. A voice can be heard yelling, "Get that motherfucker!" Rittenhouse runs out of the parking lot. And what appears to be the next video, that's an important distinction there, what appears to be the next video, taken from a different angle, Rittenhouse can be seen running down the street with many people in pursuit. Someone hits him in the back of the head. He continues running and then he trips and falls on his back. Someone yells, "Get his ass," multiple times, multiple people running toward him. One then jumps up and appears to have extended his foot over Rittenhouse's head, as if to kick his face. Rittenhouse fires. A man holding a skateboard runs at Rittenhouse, who shoots him. Another man approaches Rittenhouse, pauses, then lurches forward. Rittenhouse shoots him in the arm. Photos circulating social media appear to show the man shooting him in the arm was carrying a pistol at the time he approached and afterwards. Some Twitter users showed photos appearing to show another man who ran towards Rittenhouse while he laid on the ground holding a gun, and that the man with the skateboard was hitting him with it. While the post description isn't technically inaccurate, it is one-sided, and it's slightly spun, omitting key details such as the first shooting and the descriptions of the behaviors of his pursuers. Saying Rittenhouse simply fell and fired multiple rounds into a crowd does not tell the whole story. Much more was going on. The Associated Press, which has a censor bias, though borderline lean left, has omitted many details in the article on the incident, which focused heavily on the fact that Rittenhouse appeared to have support of law enforcement. Right-rated outlets such as the Daily Caller also noted that Rittenhouse supported law enforcement but provided more details of the incident than the Washington Post, including full videos of the shooting and that Rittenhouse was being chased. And that's easy. That's easy. I mean, you can include those things when your goal is to make sure people are informed and you want the truth of the situation to be out there and so that way people know. You don't leave those things out there. And I'm not going to cut some of these places like the Associated Press or the Washington Post. I'm not cutting them any slack because they have the resources. They have the manpower to go out and find the facts of this situation. But I mean, again, when you only care about a particular narrative, you're going to do things like this. And this is why all the time that it is extremely important to get your news from multiple sources. And we're going to go into detail on how you can do that easily on Thursday, but it's extremely important because this happens. Things like this happen. And I really don't want the independent movement, as it's beginning to take shape, to fall into this type of behavior. It's just something that I'm not interested in at all. Let's go back to the article. Breitbart's coverage, right rate bias, of the incident omitted specific details of the shooting. It included a photo of Rittenhouse cleaning graffiti from the Kenosha courthouse earlier in the day. Breitbart also included a tweet from a reporter who interviewed Rittenhouse just prior to the incident and said Rittenhouse did not make any racist comments, condemn BLM, or mention political motivations for his actions. All of these media outlets omitted details about the first shooting in the parking lot, while all of them mentioned that armed civilians were present that night with the stated aim of protecting property and businesses to fill the void by local law enforcement. Plenty of the commentary of the incident flying around social media with people arguing protesters were motivated to chase Rittenhouse because he was the first shooting in the parking lot in order to subdue him, and others arguing that Rittenhouse was being reportedly pursued and physically attacked, so he acted, for the most part, in self-defense. It's up to the courts to decide if Rittenhouse was acting in self-defense or breaking laws, not the media or the court of public opinion. But reporters should at least get full details to avoid charges of bias. Not only that, avoid future violence. Not only that, it's just the right thing to do. It's just the right thing to do, to give both sides of the argument. Because if you aren't doing that, if you aren't giving out both sides of the argument, then you are doing a huge, huge disservice to the people who follow your outlet. So as I said earlier, I thought this was a very interesting thread, and I wanted to bring it to you, at least the description of the thread, and then I'll sort of comment on it. The title, again, was, "As a centrist, I am scared of the extremism from both sides, and I worry it will affect this election." I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it's been affecting society for a while now, and with the advent of social media, it has only gotten worse. So the description reads, "Recent events are surely a big part of my feeling towards being scared that extremists will alter the outcome of the election. Not just militia supremacists, but also the looters. IDs are not checked to protest. Anyone with an agenda could be in the protest crowd or militia groups. They could be anarchists, fascists, racists. Literally anyone could attempt to agitate the situation either way, and they would likely succeed. I'm surprised the situation isn't actually worse." And honestly, it's trending that way. Donald Trump finally commented on what happened in Washington, and Biden also made his speech in Pennsylvania about the violence. As well-meaning as militia might be for protecting their towns, the likelihood of something bad happening due to more extreme members is a cause for great concern. Same for the protesters. Some are certainly well-meaning in that they want to protest injustice, but looters and others are trying to take advantage of the situation or even provoke the situation is also a great cause for concern. Both candidates are trying to make this to be an advantage for them and a disadvantage for the other, which is, I guess, standard politics. All while other important concerns about the candidates' qualifications are pushed to the side and out of the spotlight. This is one of the complaints by many progressives about the DNC, about the fact that most of this was just anti-Trump and not necessarily focused on policy. This to me means the outcome of the election will be driven by immediate fears, immediate anger, and as opposed to the history and the qualifications of the candidates. Both sides need to realize their extremes are absolutely not helping their cause right now. The actions of the extremes are just fueling the other side and polluting this election. But this isn't helping either side. The election should not come down to which side extreme edges are able to avoid making the news. But that's what it's turning into. So there's plenty of interesting comments. There's over 32 comments on the thread. So, of course, you'll be linked to this in the show notes. But I thought this was worthy of being talked about because you see this especially right now with the temperature starting to come to a head, with finally the Democrats are acknowledging what's going on. Now, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, this has been going on since what, late May. Late May, we have seen protests, we have seen rioting, we have seen cars and buildings on fire nonstop since late May. And what I find frustrating is that Joe Biden finally said something about this, only because the polls were starting to turn against him. And that's really, really bad. Now, as I said, he spoke about the violence going on, and he did not specifically name Antifa or BLM, but that's okay. But here's a little bit of what he said.
Good afternoon. I want to thank Carnegie Mellon for providing this space and all the promise it holds for future jobs in a high-tech world. In the recent days, we've had a lot of talk about who's going where and how I've decided to come to Pittsburgh to talk a little bit about what's going on right now. In the early days of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt told the country, and I quote, "The news is going to get worse and worse before it gets better and better. And the American people deserve to have it straight from the shoulder." Straight from the shoulder. The job of a president is to tell it straight from the shoulder. Tell the truth, to be candid, to face facts, to lead, not to incite. That's why I'm speaking to you today. The incumbent president is incapable of telling us the truth, incapable of facing the facts, and incapable of healing. He doesn't want to shed light. He wants to generate heat, and he's stoking violence in our cities. You know, this is a tragic fact of the matter that...
Now, to me, and I've made this point on Twitter, it's one thing to me if they, as in Joe Biden, and acknowledges like, hey, you know, I made a mistake. We did not take this seriously enough. I'm going to contact Ted Wheeler. I'm going to contact all of these other mayors across the country where the violence and looting is taking place, because they are exclusively in Democratic cities. And I'm going to tell them to get a hold on the chaos, whether that be militarily or, you know, propose some sort of actual agenda. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen in Portland, because they're already at the mayor's, I guess, second house or whatever, broke in to the place, and they're demanding that he resign and actually or defund the police. So that, I suppose, is the real danger for I would say the Democrats, is allowing some of these more extreme fringes to garner so much attention. So one more thing on the extremism of the left. There's been stuff going on in Portland for years at this point. Years. And we're just now talking about it, which to me is ridiculous. But again, this is welcome to 2020, where everything is politicized. And the only reason why we're talking about this now is because Joe Biden's poll numbers are beginning to drop. But Trump should not escape blame here at all, because he has not done a good job at tamping down the temperature at all. Now, he, to his credit, he's actually been talking about what's been going on in the cities. And I guess that's another thing that I find frustrating, is that he's offered federal help to, you know, supplement these local police forces to help tamp down the violence. And they've all, I think up to this point, rejected it, I think minus Kenosha, Wisconsin. So that's why I find it frustrating. And that's why I think Joe Biden should step up and contact these mayors and say, hey, you know, we need to do something. But again, Trump could have done a better job with this situation. He could have done a much better job handling what happened after the George Floyd protest began. The old show where he tear gassed peaceful protesters, like actual peaceful protesters, to get a photo op of him holding up the Bible was absolutely silly. He has not handled this situation with the type of leadership you would hope a president should have. And that's what's been frustrating as all hell to me is that I can handle some of the excesses of Trump, but to me, he doesn't have the ability to actually flip the switch. As the old saying goes, get you somebody who can do both. I think the temperature would be much lower and not as volatile as it is right now had he had the ability to, once in a while talk presidential, or at least not be as polarizing as he is. And that's contributed to the temperature of the country being so incredibly high. I mean, in a literal sense, because it's really hot outside, but the electorate being so angry. And I'm not really sure how the rest of this year is going to turn out. All I know is I'm not looking forward to the election as I was at the beginning of this year. But again, this is why I do this podcast. This is why I wanted to do the specific segments. It's why I do what I do, is that I want to provide an alternative. There is an alternative. People are ready for an alternative. And I think when that opening comes, we have to be ready. So the reason why I declined to go in detail about the shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, is because I wanted to wait for more information to come out, which to me is always the best option. It's always the best option. We wait for more information to come out. And I know in this world where we get everything instantaneously, that may be difficult, but it's necessary. Patience is truly a virtue, and it's a virtue that I want associated with the independent movement. When people think of independence, I want patience to be a part of what they picture. And I think it's necessary because you take the Jacob Blake situation and you can say that the initial information was enough for you, and that even if some more information were to come out, there was no way to justify the police shooting him in the back 7 times. That's fine. But I mean, we were told originally that he was there to break up a fight, and then someone called the cops, and then he went back to his car and then was proceeded to be shot in the back 7 times. It turns out the cops were called. He had a warrant for his arrest. It sounds like he did have a weapon on him, and the place where he was at which was his ex-girlfriend's. He was not supposed to be there. Now, here's one thing, an interesting thing pointed out by Zed Jelani, who is an excellent follow on Twitter. I think he also has the back channel on YouTube. So I definitely suggest you go follow that or subscribe to the channel. Very interesting channel that they have. I know they've had Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi. He's been on there. Very great YouTube channel. Well, anyway, there's an interesting thread that he had posted on Twitter, and I have to look at it because it really brings home the point that everyone should have waited. So the first one, it says, Mother Jones, even if Blake had resisted officers and did have a knife on his possession somewhere, that should not be the justification of offloading 7 rounds into his back as he was walking away from them towards his kids. Has anyone ever reported on the story, talked to Blake's ex-girlfriend? Several of his family members who weren't there that day have been interviewed. Why is there an assumption throughout that he wasn't a threat to the kids? Now, this is something that I had totally not thought about because, as we know, there were kids in the car at the time, and this is what a lot of people were angry about. One of the open questions that hasn't been answered in the reporting is this. Why were the kids in the car to begin with? If it was not his car, he was stealing the car from his ex-girlfriend. How did the kids get in there? So that is an interesting question. So if he was kidnapping the kids because, again, he had a warrant out for his arrest and he wasn't supposed to, be there. I believe she had an order of protection against him. If that's the case, does that justify what happened? Now, who knows? I don't know. I would love for a full investigation. I'm assuming we're going to get something to come out of the situation. Jacob Blake, of course, is not dead, but he is paralyzed. One of the bullets did hit him in the spine. So I suppose that's the one positive thing to come out of this story. But think about this. Had the tweets that I just read you, had that been the storyline day one, maybe we don't have the riots in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Maybe, just maybe, Kyle isn't in a situation where he ends up shooting 2 people and killing them. Maybe this could have been avoided if we had patience. Everyone's so quick to rush to judgment on a lot of things, and that's not something that I want associated with our movement. Taking time, gathering evidence, and making rational, pragmatic decisions is what this country needs right now. Well, that's it for the Political Independent. I truly appreciate you listening. If you'd like to reach me, do so at politicpodcast@gmail.com. I did mention earlier that we were going to talk about how to be informed, like how to diversify your news sources, talk about all sides. I may not be doing that. I may have an interview coming on Thursday, so that hasn't been finalized just yet. So that's why I didn't want to make a definite call as to what was happening on Thursday. But I guess you'll find out when you see the episode uploaded on Thursday, and I'll see you then.
Thank you for listening to the American Electorate Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, feel free to subscribe and share the podcast. It really helps.